The piano was screaming, not playing, screaming. Jerry Lee Lewis's hands were moving so fast across the keys they looked like they might catch fire. His blonde hair was soaked with sweat, his shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, and he was pounding that Backstage upright piano like he was trying to kill it. The sound echoed through the narrow hallway of the Shreveport Municipal Auditorium, bouncing off cinder block walls that had absorbed decades of cigarette smoke and bourbon-fueled arguments. It was August 1958, and everyone backstage knew Jerry Lee Lewis was in one of his moods, the dangerous kind. The kind where he'd already had too much to drink, too much attention, and not nearly enough fear from the people around him. He'd just come off stage from a performance that had the Louisiana crowd on their feet, screaming his name like he was some kind of deity. And maybe, in that moment, Jerry Lee believed he was. Nobody in that hallway was moving. The stage crew stood frozen with equipment in their hands. A young sound engineer pressed himself against the wall, trying to be invisible. Even the venue manager, a man who dealt with every kind of drunk performer Louisiana could produce, kept his distance. But what happened in the next 10 minutes would become one of those stories that people still argue about in Nashville dive bars. The night Jerry Lee Lewis tried to test Johnny Cash. And the night he learned that some men don't need to be loud to be dangerous. Johnny Cash had arrived at the venue 3 hours earlier. Not through the front entrance where fans might mob him, but through the loading dock, carrying his own guitar case, wearing that black suit that had become his uniform. His face looked tired. Not just tired from the road, but tired in that deeper way, the kind that comes from fighting demons that don't sleep when you do. He'd been on tour for 6 weeks straight. Small venues across the South, one-night stands where you performed, collected your money, and drove to the next town before sunrise. His marriage was falling apart. The pills that were supposed to keep him awake were making it impossible to sleep, even when he had the chance. And his father's voice still echoed in his head every time he looked in a mirror, telling him he'd never amount to anything. But none of that showed on his face as he walked through that backstage hallway. His expression was neutral, unreadable, like a man who'd learned to keep his pain behind locked doors. Jerry Lee didn't notice him at first. He was too busy performing for the small crowd of hangers-on who'd gathered to watch him abuse the piano. He was playing Great Balls of Fire for the 3rd time in a row, adding runs and flourishes that got more aggressive with each repetition. His voice was hoarse from screaming the lyrics, and there was something almost violent in the way his hands attacked the keys. "Nobody!" Jerry Lee shouted between phrases, his Mississippi accent thick as Delta mud. "Nobody plays like the Killer!" It was a statement, a challenge, a dare for anyone in that hallway to disagree. The stage manager, a thin man named Vernon who'd worked at the venue for 20 years, caught sight of Johnny and his face went pale. He knew what was about to happen. Or rather, he knew that something was about to happen, and it probably wouldn't be good for his blood pressure. Johnny stopped about 10 feet from the piano. He didn't announce himself, didn't say a word, just stood there in that black suit, a guitar case in one hand, absolutely still in a room full of chaos. Jerry Lee finished his run with a dramatic flourish, hands crashing down on the keys so hard the piano actually moved. His followers clapped and whistled. Someone handed him a bottle of bourbon. He took a long drink, and that's when he saw Johnny standing there. The room didn't go quiet, not immediately. But the energy shifted. Everyone who understood anything about the music business, about egos, about how men like Jerry Lee Lewis measured other men, felt it happen. Jerry Lee's eyes narrowed. He was drunk, but not so drunk he didn't recognize Johnny Cash. They'd crossed paths before. Sun records in Memphis, radio shows, award ceremonies. They existed in the same universe, but they were different species. Jerry Lee was all explosive energy, volcanic ego, chaos barely contained by skin. Johnny was controlled burn, slow thunder, darkness that didn't need to announce itself. Well, well, Jerry Lee said, his voice carrying that particular tone successful men use when they're about to prove something. Johnny Cash, the man in black. Come to see how a real performer works? Nobody laughed. Even Jerry Lee's entourage knew better than to laugh at Johnny Cash. Johnny still didn't speak. He just looked at Jerry Lee with those dark eyes that had seen the inside of too many jail cells, too many bottle bottoms, too many 3 a.m. highways where the yellow lines blurred into one continuous stream. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. Jerry Lee didn't like silence. Silence meant he wasn't the center of attention. Silence meant the energy wasn't focused on him. So he did what he always did when he felt control slipping. He got louder. You think you're tough, Cash? Jerry Lee stood up from the piano bench, bourbon bottle still in his hand. He was shorter than Johnny, but built solid, with the kind of wiry strength that came from growing up poor and fighting for everything. You think that black suit makes you dangerous? You think walking around like some kind of preacher makes you special? Someone in the back of the hallway whispered, Jesus Christ. Vernon, the stage manager, took 2 steps toward the exit, already calculating how fast he could get security if this went bad. But Johnny just stood there. He set his guitar case down slowly, carefully, like a man who had all the time in the world. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, and lit one. The match flare briefly illuminated his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the deep lines around his eyes. I don't think anything, Jerry, Johnny said finally. His voice was quiet, not whispering, but quiet in that way that made people lean in to hear. I just know when the music stops, you're still scared of the silence. The hallway went absolutely dead. Jerry Lee's face flushed red. Whether from anger or embarrassment or the bourbon, nobody could tell. His hand tightened around the bottleneck until his knuckles went white. You calling me scared? Jerry Lee's voice was rising now, getting that edge that meant violence was maybe 3 sentences away. Me? The killer? I ain't scared of nothing. Not God, not the devil, not you in your Undertaker suit. Johnny took a drag from his cigarette. Exhaled slowly. The smoke drifted up toward the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. That's the problem, Jerry. You're so busy telling everyone you're not scared, you don't hear how loud that sounds. Someone dropped something metal in the back of the hallway. The clang echoed like a gunshot. Nobody moved to pick it up. Jerry Lee Lewis had been challenged before. Had been in bar fights, backstage brawls, arguments with producers and promoters and police. He knew how to escalate, knew how to use his reputation as the killer to intimidate. But Johnny Cash wasn't reacting the way people usually reacted. He wasn't backing down, but he also wasn't squaring up for a fight. He was just standing there, smoking, looking at Jerry Lee like a man observing something mildly interesting, but not particularly important. And somehow that was worse than any insult or threat could have been. You think you're better than me? Jerry Lee took a step forward. The bourbon bottle hung loose in his hand, and everyone in that hallway knew it could become a weapon in half a second. You think your prison songs and your sad ballads make you deeper, make you more real? I sell records, Cash. I fill arenas. I got women screaming my name in every city in America. Johnny flicked ash from his cigarette onto the concrete floor. Yeah, I bet the silence in your hotel room after they leave is real loud, too. The words landed like a physical blow. Jerry Lee actually flinched, because Johnny had found it. The thing Jerry Lee spent all his energy running from. The quiet moments. The times between performances when the crowd was gone and the adrenaline faded and you were just a man alone with your thoughts and your failures and your fears. You son of a... Jerry Lee started forward, bottle rising. Jerry. Johnny's voice didn't get louder, didn't get harder. but something in the tone made Jerry Lee stop mid-step. "You can swing that bottle if you want. Maybe you'll hit me. Maybe you won't. But either way, tomorrow morning you'll still be the guy who needs everyone in the room to look at him, and I'll still be the guy who doesn't." The hallway was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls. Someone's breath was too loud. A jacket rustled. The distant sound of the crowd in the auditorium leaked through closed doors like the ocean heard through a shell. Jerry Lee stood there, bottle half raised, his face cycling through emotions too fast to name. Rage, confusion, something that might have been recognition. The recognition that maybe, just maybe, Johnny Cash understood exactly what Jerry Lee was running from. Because Johnny was running from the same thing. He just ran quieter. Slowly, Jerry Lee lowered the bottle. He looked at it like he was surprised it was in his hand. Then he looked back at Johnny, and something in his expression had changed. The wild energy was still there, but it was different now. Less performative. More real. "How do you do it?" Jerry Lee asked, and his voice had lost its edge. "How do you stand the quiet?" Johnny took one last drag from his cigarette and dropped it on the concrete, crushing it under his boot heel. "I don't," he said. "I just stop pretending I'm not scared of it." He picked up his guitar case, nodded once to Jerry Lee, then he walked past him, down the hallway toward his dressing room. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. Everyone in that space knew what had just happened, even if they couldn't quite put it into words. Jerry Lee stood there for a long moment, the bourbon bottle forgotten in his hand. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, "God damn." Vernon, the stage manager, finally remembered how to breathe. The hangers-on started moving again, unsure what they'd just witnessed. Someone tried to laugh, tried to break the tension, but the sound died in their throat. Jerry Lee sat back down at the piano, but he didn't start playing. He just sat there, hands resting on the keys, silent. Years later, in an interview for a music documentary, Jerry Lee Lewis was asked about Johnny Cash. The interviewer brought up their early rivalry, the competition, the stories about backstage confrontations. Jerry Lee got quiet. Unusual for a man who'd spent his entire career being as loud as possible. Then he said something that surprised everyone listening. "Johnny Cash was the only man I ever met who scared me without trying to. Most people, they want to intimidate you. They puff up, they get loud, they show you how tough they are. Johnny didn't do none of that. He just existed, and somehow that was scarier than anything else, because he'd made peace with his demons, or at least stopped running from them. And a man who ain't running is dangerous in a way I couldn't understand back then," the interviewer pressed. "What changed?" Jerry Lee smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "I got older, got tired, and one night, sitting alone in a hotel room after a show, the silence got so loud I couldn't stand it. And I remembered what Johnny said to me in Shreveport, about how I was scared of the quiet, and I realized he'd been right all along." The story became legend in Nashville. The night Johnny Cash faced down Jerry Lee Lewis without raising his voice, without making a threat, without needing to prove anything. But the people who were there, in that hallway in Shreveport, they tell a more nuanced version. They talk about two men who were both drowning, just using different strokes. One was thrashing and splashing, making sure everyone knew he was in the water. The other was sinking quietly, accepting the depth. Neither way was better. Neither way was worse. But only one of them pretended he wasn't drowning at all. That was the difference between Jerry Lee Lewis and Johnny Cash. And on that August night in 1958, in a backstage hallway that smelled like cigarettes and bourbon and desperation, that difference was briefly, painfully clear. The music business is full of stories about egos clashing, about artists fighting for dominance, about who was tougher or more talented or more successful. But the real story isn't about winning or losing. It's about two men standing in a hallway, both carrying weight they couldn't name, both scared of the same silence, just expressing it in opposite ways. Johnny Cash walked away from that confrontation the same man he walked into it. Quiet, controlled, carrying his darkness like a familiar coat. Jerry Lee Lewis went back to the piano eventually, started playing again, got loud again. But something had changed, even if it took him decades to understand what. Maybe that's why people still tell this story in dive bars and recording studios, not because it was dramatic or violent or satisfying in any conventional way, but because it was true in a way that most stories aren't. Two men, both legends, both broken in their own ways, briefly seeing themselves reflected in each other. And in that moment of recognition, Jerry Lee Lewis learned that the loudest sound in the world isn't a screaming piano or a roaring crowd. It's the silence inside a man who's stopped running from himself. Johnny Cash knew that silence well. He'd been living in it for years,